Hi there. My name is McKaylee Ogletree, and this is my unit for Case Connections. Here is my name and the date. Alrighty. So to get started, I selected case number one. And in this case, we specifically see a newborn female who is presenting with lethargy, hypothermia, and apnea after 24 hours of being born. So when we look at the blood work specifically in this case, blood work shows elevation in ammonia at the time of birth and a significant increase in that ammonia level 24 hours later. Specifically, the difference between the two was about 286 of an increase. Urine analysis revealed elevation in urine orotic acid and creatine, and the plasmin sertraline was also normal. So, before we begin discussing this case in detail, it's really important that we understand the mechanisms of ammonia transfer throughout the body to help us better understand the impact that this abnormal ammonia transfer is having on this infant. So, ammonia exists as an ammonium ion that's also known as NH4 plus at a physiological pH. So that's just the ideal pH that we would see ammonium at. It is primarily produced through transamination and deamination. So for organic chemistry terms here, we're talking about transamination being the removal of an amino group from a specific amino acid and transferring that into a keto acid, and then deamination specifically being the removal of an amino acid entirely from a specific molecule. So transamination followed by deamination after is a specific mechanism used to produce ammonia in the body. Ammonia production is huge within the body and is used pretty much in every single tissue, and a variety of different compounds that contain nitrogen can be used in this process. Glutamate dehydrogenase is a specific mitochondrial enzyme, and it works during amination of an alpha ketoglutarate to turn that into glutamate. And this plays a huge role specifically in the detoxification of ammonia to keep it from being toxic to the human body. Ammonia is loaded via the glutamine synthase for transport and is unloaded via glutamase. So that's loading it in for transportation throughout the body and then unloading with the glutamase. The main areas that we would expect to see the largest concentrations of this mechanism would specifically be in the kidneys and intestines, right, as we would expect, and also in the liver, but that's in much smaller amounts. Now, it's really important to specifically note that in a healthy individual, ammonia blood levels have to stay low. This is crucial in our bodies because if they raise too high, they can actually become toxic to the central nervous system, which can throw all kinds of things off. So, when we're looking at this case, we can also talk about the nitrogen transport and its connection to gluconeogenesis in a fasted state. When we talk about the fasted state, the body is in a depleted state and the carbohydrate sources are drained and amino acids become fuel for gluconeogenesis in the body. So when we talk about gluconeogenesis, we're referring to a group of reactions that strive to maintain blood glucose levels throughout fasting periods. When the body needs amino acids for fuel during gluconeogenesis, NAD plus is reduced to NADH in order to complete the following step of 1,3-biphosphoglycerate to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The nitrogen transport chain can quite literally be noted as a crucial step in generating pyruvate, which is used to provide the body with fuel whenever we're fasting or not putting in active nutrients. In this specific case, the urea cycle enzyme that this patient is most likely deficient in, I believe, is OTC. And it's important to note that this is incredibly rare, especially in females. given the analysis that was listed, we see really high levels of orotic acid, but with normal plasma sertraline levels. So this is a very common red flag trademark of OTC deficiency or OTC dysfunction. And oftentimes patients with OTC have elevated urinary orotic acid due to the accumulation of carbamyl phosphate in the cytoplasm that's redirected into pyrimidine synthesis. But it is also important to notice that there was no significant increase in other proteins in the cycle, which is how we kind of are able to isolate the OTC as the source of the problem. So diagnosing symptoms in girls with OTC deficiency, it often includes several different variables which exactly match the case that we're given. It includes things like apnea, lethargy, and hyperammonemia, which is most commonly presented as hypothermia. I probably butchered the correct pronunciation of that word, but it is definitely in my script for the right pronunciation. I'm sure I will learn the closer I get to medical school how to say that correctly. So on the contrary, we would expect to see carbamyl phosphatase synthase 1 as the enzyme that is the least impaired. Now, this is really great news for the patient, specifically the patient's family, because CPS1 deficiencies are actually the most detrimental and most severe of all urea cycle disorders. Like we talked about before, when there's a deficiency in the OTC, carbamyl phosphate accumulates in the mitochondria, but it functions as normal. So we would not expect to see any change here. Raised orotic acid in patients is actually a key variable in distinguishing between CPS1 deficiency and OTC deficiency, as it shows the problem doesn't reside in CPS1 at all. As plasma citrulline levels are often normal and unremarkable in patients with OTC deficiency, there is oftentimes a resulting arginine deficiency. So this actually leads to arginine becoming an essential amino acid, or something that we can take in to help maintain normal protein synthesis rate in an individual who quite honestly does not have normal protein synthesis rate. So that's case 1. And I've already spent 7 minutes talking about it. So we're going to move on to case 3, which is my next selected case. Try and be a little quicker here. In case 3, we see a 47-year-old man presenting with severe pain in the right great toe, unable to bear weight on it after no notable trauma to the foot. Pain has increased in severity over the span of 24 hours, and he has been diagnosed with gout, elevated levels of plasma urate, and elevated levels of urinary uric acid resulting from high plasma uric acid. The patient also states that he has recently switched from diet soda to normal soda because he was worried that the zero sugar may actually be more harmful for him than full sugar. So based on the information provided, the best explanation for the presentation of gout in the patient is decreased urinary excretion of uric acid. Though this was a hard question because there is one other answer which we can discuss in a moment that is also very tempting. Gout is described as an excess of uric acid in the body, which is normally a waste product in a healthy human. As uric acid builds up in a patient with gout, instead of being able to get rid of that, small needle-like crystal deposits pile underneath the joints and cause several areas of pain. Given the patient has elevated levels of urinary uric acid, we can immediately identify that this is a true statement, statement 1. Statement 1 regarding the overproduction of purines as the root cause of gout is also intriguing. So, retract. Not statement 1. Statement 1 is the other tempting statement, but the primary statement that would be the greatest reason for diagnosis would be that the patient is decreased in urinary excretion of uric acid. Now, like I said, statement 1 regarding overproduction of purines as the root cause is also very intriguing because purines are in fact later metabolized into uric acid. Sometimes overproduction of uric acid may be linked to an abnormality in enzymes that result in purine metabolism, but not necessarily just the purines alone. This answer would not lead to an increased risk or diagnosis of gout based on the information provided, specifically taking the information that we were given from the case. So just that small amount of information that we received in the case summary wouldn't quite define this as being a purine alone situation. The same idea remains with answer choice 2, stating that the root cause comes from a decreased salvage of purines. Again, this is not the root cause of gout because we would not expect to see a decrease in purine levels. Rather, we would expect to see high levels of purine concentration. So in order to better understand and diagnose the patient with certainty and further localize the root cause, there are a few different things that I would probably request just to be able to further localize the specific area of lesion and also the root cause of what's going on. A few really great tests would include joint fluid analysis to check for the specific presence of uric acid crystals in different areas, and also additional labs that would look at patients' creatine, blood urea, nitrogen, and also a possible ultrasound if needed to detect urate crystals in the joints and also rule out any other ominous conditions that could be the source of pain. Because again, when we have a patient with severe pain that's kind of come out of nowhere, that raises a lot of red flags. And also with elevated labs, we'd want to check and make sure there wasn't anything suspicious like a mass or something of that sort. Lastly, we can discuss the Coca-Cola situation, the soda pop situation, where the patient states that he has stopped drinking diet soda and started back with normal soda in excess amounts, which, as discussed in the passage, contains large amounts of high fructose corn syrup. So this is actually going to do nothing but harm the patient. As more high fructose corn syrup in the patient, the more high production of purines and higher level of uric acid in the joints his body is going to make every single day, which for a patient who already has gout, this is really, really a bad deal. As mentioned above, the higher levels of purines may not be the primary cause of this situation, but they definitely contribute, and an increase in the purine levels can increase the severity of gout in several different instances. Several different drinks can trigger or worsen gout, specifically alcohol, sugar-filled sodas, and also sugar-filled fruit juices, which we know are actually just packed full of sugar. They don't even really contain any fruit juice value for the most part. So my advice specifically to this patient would be to remove soda from his daily diet entirely if possible, or specifically try and wean off of it, given the patient is on a really high amount of soda every single day. Start implementing healthy drinks such as water, and eating more fruits and vegetables, low fat, maybe dairy-free items. A lot of research also shows gluten-free items can be helpful in this situation at reducing inflammation. Even though many sodas show that they may have 0 sugars in the body or in the drink, the patient is correct in stating that fake sugars are not necessarily good for the body by any stretch. Furthermore, I would make the patient aware that by continually pumping his body with soda and high fructose corn sugars, he's actually putting himself at a greater risk of recurrent attacks of gout and longer duration in recovery, as well as higher chances of developing polyarthritic disease. Being someone who suffers from an autoimmune disease myself, suffering from Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, when we talk about inflammation, it comes in several different ways. And so anything you can do to reduce inflammation and calm the body's inflammation, that is going to be something positive for the patient. So ideally, we would want patients to stop sodas completely, if not completely, weaning off of sodas and starting to implement more water into the diet. So that's everything I've got for these cases. I know I went a little bit long, but I hope that was descriptive. Thank you so much.